Let me take you back to the 1990s. You know, there was a period of time in the 90s that people today, and even people back then, felt that metal perhaps was on its last legs. It was a dying breed, something that was just a passing trend. Something that had gained all of its exposure, all of its height, momentum, all of its fierce, rabid fan base in the 1980s. Something that was just as trendy as disco was in the 1970s and psychedelic rock was in the, late 1960s, early 1970s. Something that was going to be just loved by a couple of rare individuals in hushed tones for the rest of eternity. Definitely not something that was going to end up lasting the test of time. Even though in the first part of the 1990s there was a boom, there was a swill of new bands in the death and extreme metal scene, it was still something that was not getting the publication. It wasn't getting the attention. It was instead grunge that was getting the attention. A new scene from Seattle, Washington that was raked with flannel and heroin. It was almost like metal lost its momentum all of a sudden. Even though Metallica's The Black Album remains the best-selling domestic album, really, in history, it didn't matter. It seemed as though metal had been largely forgotten about. And Metallica, in fact, even though they were a metal band, were being treated as a crossover product. Something that was now over on the rock and roll side. Something that America was used to. Something that America accepted. Whereas the remainder of metal was kind of annexed aside, except in certain areas. I present to you a different view. I present to you something that many people will probably call bullshit on. However, it's alarming that this is what's believed. It's alarming that it's believed that metal was dead during the 1990s, that it was on its death knell. When in reality, when you consult all of the archives, whenever you consult some of the greatest albums that this genre has ever seen, you'll notice that there's actually a number of them from the 1990s. You'll consider the fact that a lot of bands that we actually are obsessed with today, a lot of the bands that really have influenced what heavy metal is and have really found success within the revival that occurred in the latter portion of the 1990s going into the 2000s, really got started in the early 1990s. The real problem wasn't the fact that metal had died, it was the fact that it wasn't being, well published, well spoken about. Those that were within the circle knew what was going on. They knew that something was brewing, and they knew that it was in the underground. Whether or not it was going to ever make it to the top and, be like it was in the 1980s again, well, they had no idea. But it was something that they wanted to be a part of, to keep the metal hammer and the metal flag burning high. And that's exactly what happened. It was almost as though the genre itself knew that it was a sleeping giant. It had had its time, and then it kind of went back into dormancy, to hibernation, to allow these young bands, the next crop of great metal acts, to really refine their skills, get their initial demos out, initial first couple of albums before they were unleashed upon the world and came to a world audience. Really, some people could say that it was the inception of the internet and the ability for bands to market themselves through another medium as opposed to just through tape trading and fanzines in order to really spurn this. This was something that was almost grassroots. But in reality, these are fans that were already doing everything in their power to spread the word of a lot of these groups. Think about what you do today. Think about the ways in which you communicate with someone such as myself or your other friends about a new band that you discovered. Maybe somebody that you saw live with another band that you really enjoy. Either that or just something that you found while casually searching the net or something that was recommended to you. Consider the fact that you want to talk about it, you want to share that information, and you actually want to give that band some additional support. Now imagine that we didn't have the power of instantaneous messaging. Now imagine that we had to, call these other individuals on the phone and then somehow find a way to secure their work. Usually if it was a cassette, you could easily copy it, and that was about it. But in many cases, if it was available to purchase in a store, then that's what you did. That's how you gained access. Grunge in the early part of the 1990s definitely did a lot to shield some of the great heavy metal that was coming up from the public eye. And of course, there are a lot of scandals that occurred during that same time period that really didn't help metal's image all of that much. And of course I am speaking about the black metal scandals over in Europe. The church burnings, Varg all the names that we really speak about with a lot of casualty. We just speak them like it's nobody, like it's an uncle, or like it's a hero, all depending on who you ask, all depending on who you talk to. However, what was also happening around this time was black metal was exploding onto the scene. It was becoming a huge deal, something that today is definitely a huge, huge wing of metal. We're already on generation, 3, potentially even 4. And there are new bands that are cropping up every single day. And they're ones that are trying to push the boundaries and the envelopes of what black metal is all about. Death metal is reaching its 4th generation, maybe going into its 5th even, all depending on who you ask and how you do the dividing line. But it's another huge part of the extreme metal scene. Very similar to what it became eventually grindcore and really just a punk metal or just a strange form of extreme metal that really spurned in England in the 1980s with bands such as Napalm Death. But instead it was all of the groups that grew up in Florida that were really making a huge scene here in America in the 1990s especially, with some huge albums being released by bands such as Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Morbid Angel, Death. Bands that may have gotten their start in the 1980s, but in the 1990s were releasing masterpieces. Albums such as The Incomplete by Obituary. Albums like Symbolic by Death. Ones that are considered to be classics. And then think about what's going on in the rest of the world. Think about the bands that are getting started. Think about the bands that we now talked about all the time. Whether it be on this channel, or just on Facebook, or just as a metal community as a general. Think about the earliest Opeth works that happened in the 1990s. Think about albums from bands such as Emperor, Immortal, 1990s. Think about the whole entire Gothenburg metal scene. Think about how things kind of transferred over into that with bands such as At the Gates and some of the latter Carcass albums before they went on their long, lengthy hiatus that seemed like it would never end. Think about Dark Tranquillity and In Flames. Think about that whole entire crop. Think about how huge the Gothenburg scene has become, and it was something that started 1990s. That's right. Think about how big the metalcore scene is. Think about how big the deathcore scene is. Think about how a lot of those bands near the latter portions of the 1990s were first getting their start. Think about bands such as Shadows Fall, who near the turn of the millennium were releasing Of One Blood. Think about how all of these bands were inspired, at least partially, from a band that was huge during the 1990s. They weren't a band that debuted in the 1990s, and that's definitely something that a lot of people believe. But Pantera, of course. Pantera was one of the shining beacons during the 1990s. Many people say that they effectively saved metal because they kept metal, at least here in America, still somewhat in the public eye. It still gave people an opinion to be had about heavy metal. Even though bands such as Megadeth and Slayer were still releasing albums, even though Testament was, experimenting a little bit, there were a lot of groups within those arenas that did some things to change up their sound and try new things. With Metallica going with the load and reload cycle and embracing a more bluesy effort, with Megadeth kind of going a little bit more commercial with their ideas of heavy metal, and with Testament kind of changing things up every so often just to kind of see what happens. Anthrax were exactly releasing Stone Cold classics, all depending on who you ask. But it was the underground scene that was really spurning everything along. It was the underground scene that was really keeping everything together. And it was all the groups, all the bands, their tireless efforts that were really about to become all very worth it. Think of a band such as Machine Head, Rob Flynn. Think about it. Think about the fact that in the 1990s they released their first album. They released Burn My Eyes. It's a hugely transitional album. Think about Fear Factory. Think about a group such as that. Think of, if you're my age, if you're right around the cusp of 30 years old and you were cognizant, aware of things that were happening in the 1990s, or even if you're a little older, or even if you've just done a lot of history and you're younger, think about all of the great bands and albums that the 1990s produced. Think about all the albums that are in your collection, and think about the ones that you treasure. Think about Focus by Cynic. Think about the earliest albums from Atheist. Those are another pair of just tremendously classic albums that are almost impossible to avoid mentioning here in the metal community. Think about all of the different elements and the branching off of metal that really occurred during this time frame as well, in its earliest inception points for some. And then think about what eventually happened. Yes, in Europe and in other locations in other parts of the world, this was never a problem. Metal being out of the spotlight was never an issue, because in their cultures, in their countries, it was a fabric, it was a portion. It was something that was literally happening underneath their nose, or, in some countries, something that was happening very well in front of them. And then also think of some of the other big things that happened. You know, here in America, we hear that Iron Maiden lost Bruce Dickinson, and Rob Halford leaves Judas Priest, and we're thinking, fuck. There's two heroes that are now going to be replaced by not them. We're a little fickle around here. And for one, I thought the Blaze Bayley albums from Iron Maiden weren't that bad. Especially the X Factor. That was really good. Ripper Owens, he did what he could. But there were a lot of others that felt that that was the end. That literally everything was being ushered away from metal and toward grunge. By 1995 and 1996, grunge was dead, along with Kurt Cobain. Lane Staley was about 6 years removed from his death. It was going to happen. But Alice in Chains were no more. Soundgarden were on their way to breaking up. Nirvana was no more. Pearl Jam was still around, but Pearl Jam were also a very different band. Around this time frame, two things happened in America. The first thing was that with the fall of grunge, it gave ample opportunity for the boy and girl group explosion to occur. Britney Spears, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Christina Aguilera, 98 Degrees, you name it, and it had the perfect opportunity. But it also gave heavy metal an opportunity. It gave something that was maybe not as technical, not as precise, maybe not something that was as luscious and fantastic, something that was as thrashy or as brutal as we were used to really take hold and really grip the nation and remind them that heavy music still existed and remind them that heavy music was still vital. It gave nu metal the opportunity to really take over. Because not everybody was going to listen to some pop garbage. Not everybody was going to be willing to accept that. There were going to be individuals that needed something that expressed their anger, that expressed all of that rage, all of that hate, all of that disdain that was going on. And nu metal did that. Korn, Slipknot, Disturbed, Drowning Pool, just to name a few. Godsmack. These were all bands that in the latter portion of the 1990s, especially in 1998 and 1999, and at the turn of the millennium, took off. And it was a snowball effect. Nobody wants to believe that nu metal here in America may successfully have been the reason why metal itself really made a recovery. But think about metalcore, because metalcore was the first really big scene in America in the new millennium, in the 2000s. Think about what would have happened if nu metal hadn't ushered heavy and aggressive music back onto the radios and back into the mainstream. Would metalcore have gone over the same way? Probably not. Which would have led to maybe deathcore not having the grip that it has now. Which may have led to a lot of bands not being formed, and which may have led to a lot of things never happening. In reality, the 1990s may have saved metal, instead of nearly being its death knell. The 1990s, in fact, were the sleeping giant years, the ones where metal literally had had to be the genre that was kind of on the down low, where all of these terrific artists, these wonderful artists that we love and praise today, were releasing classics underneath the noses of the mainstream media, underneath the noses of the mainstream public. Maybe they weren't selling like Master of Puppets did. Maybe they weren't selling like a Poison or a Motley Crue album. And they were definitely much better than Bon Jovi records. And I even like Bon Jovi a little bit. But maybe that's exactly what was necessary. That was what was required. That's how metal was not only saved, but actually how metal became destined to have a second coming, a resurrection, and become even bigger than it was before. Whenever you think about the 1990s and somebody says to you, after you tell them you're a metalhead, well, you know, metal almost died in the 1990s. You say to them, nay. Metal didn't almost die in the 1990s. That's whenever metal made its true ascension. And see what happens. See what they say and present some of these arguments to them. And see if they can respond, if they can reply. What are other things that you think about the 90s that actually saved metal? Other factors, other bands, other ways to boost this argument even further toward truth. Post them in the comments below. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk about how metal became the awakened giant that it is now, because of those quiet, seemingly quiet years in the 1990s. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. And if you want to hear and see more from me, I do videos every couple of days. I hope that you become a member of the nation. I hope you will join us.